So now I'd like to ask all the three speakers.
Here we'll start with the panel discussion right now. Before we start, I'll just make sure. Budeme mít tady dva mikrofony.
We will have two mics here on stage. Please raise your hand if you want to ask. You will get a microphone. You have to ask using a microphone, otherwise the translation will not work, nothing will not work. And in your conference pack, you have a QR code for Slido. I know some of you are introverts and you hate raising your hand. Sometimes you just don't feel like it. So please use the QR code to go to Slido. You also see the QR code here on the screen, and you can ask questions through Slido. Please use it. Use it to vote for questions you like. And people who are watching us online can also use Slido to ask questions. So let's do this.
Tak jenom pro připomenutí děkuji Pétě za.
Just a reminder from Petra, before we start with questions, all the presentations will be made available on the website of the conference. I also like to take screenshots and pictures, but don't worry if you missed any slides, they will all be made available to you on the conference's website. That is part of the value of this conference. So that's it. We have Zdeněk Hřib here too, yeah, so we have the three morning presenters and Zdeněk Hřib. Thank you for having joined us. I'm very happy that you stayed here for the whole morning. But I know you have a lot of daily agenda you have to take care of on your phone or computer. But I'll start with you, and then I'll switch to English. So, Mr. Hřib, what's your experience of the conference so far? 1, 2, 3 takeaways that you know are new for you and that will be helpful for your job. Thank you. It's hugely inspirational. Many of the things are definitely applicable here in Prague. In the first presentation, I like the book Asphalt Art. It was published in 2019, I think. I received the book from Sadiq Khan during a small talk in a lift in Washington. And I thought, that's amazing. We definitely have to try this in Prague. What we encountered, however, as a problem was that we cannot really do this in the historical center of Prague, not even in the larger center because of conservationists, because the protection area is quite far-reaching. So we would do it on the outskirts of Prague, and we would focus on spaces that are owned by the districts of the city. So you have to cooperate closely with the individual districts. It's a different level of government. And I do have to say that some districts are more active in this and some are less active. Some are not really favorable to it. And I'd like to, as an example, mention enlarging the tram refuge on Biskupcova Street in the Žižkov district. There was a closure because there were some roadworks there. I think they needed to fix water or gas or something. And then we followed up with an alteration. We changed the transport signage there, and then it is temporary for now, and then we will actually change the construction situation of it. So now let's start talking with our three speakers.
I'll follow up on Stefano, because you finished wonderfully with the lessons learned in Milano. But Petra and Mike, what would be the most important lessons you wish you would have known before you started your various projects around the globes? Because Stefano already mentioned, but now for you, what would be some of the lessons you wish you would have known before? Other than that, that would be the lessons learned for our audience here. What to avoid, or what to set up as a priority number 1, 2, 3.
Okay, I'll attempt an answer. Maybe it's not going to be directly to your question, though. I think for me at the beginning, because I also trained as an architect like Stefano, but working on placemaking in public spaces, at the beginning of this transition from architecture career, where I started working in a large practice, and then I very consciously actually entered this different space, I have discovered through experience, and Mike mentioned, you know, experience in something is the learning process, where the learning process happens, that actually there's always, it's always really important to observation and talking to people. And those two things were extremely important tools to use when looking at new places and looking at, you know, where we do projects. So it's not necessarily something that I wish I had known before I was doing projects, but it was something that I have in the process at the beginning learned, and which for many architects I think is still not a given. So to illustrate is as an example, and I'm gonna cut it short. In Havana, in Cuba, there's an 8-kilometer seawall promenade, which has a 4-lane road. It doesn't have any benches, doesn't have any trees. It's very hot in Havana all year round. And it's basically the barrier for the waves, and it's the most popular public space in all of Cuba. By far, it's crowded with people day and night, nighttime as well, particularly. And so it's important to understand what this space means to the people, what is the meaning, what is the story, what is the history, and obviously this space symbolizes freedom. People are looking over the horizon to a world that most of them have not experienced, that they imagine is a different world, perhaps imagine is a better world, and so on. So it's really powerful, and it's really important to make those observations before coming to quick conclusions about what a space might need. So the observation as well, just seeing, you know, how people move around, where they sit, and you know, with the Piazza Aperta program, it's very obvious, like, you know, you don't just watch, like, you know, how do people gather and sit, and if there's movable furniture, how do they use it? Observation, critical from my point of view. And then also, oftentimes, architects coming from sort of very traditional architectural schools don't, I think, feel that there is a lot that they can find out by talking to people. And that's the consultation part of it, where I'm not talking about traditional consultation where you're presenting options and people just say, you know, A or B, I like this or I don't like this. I'm talking about actually genuinely spending time in the neighborhood, talking to people, and there's always something that we find out. And the example I showed of Noordhala Fields Park was actually that there was a community of people who were really interested in this idea of fishing and model boating, and this actually helped the whole project, because we needed the topsoil for the mounds to have good soil where the grass will grow and the rubble was underneath. So this was also a practical solution to the design that we were envisaging. So I think there's always something to find out. Observation and talking to people, always critical.
Cool, thank you. Mike, how about you?
A lot of lessons, a lot of mistakes, a lot of failures to learn from. But I think overall, when you're starting this work, start smaller than small. You know, start smaller than you would even think. Start on one crosswalk, one corner. Don't even think about the full block or the full intersection. As you would experiment with the process, the materials, the engagement, just to get more comfortable with that. I think oftentimes we see partners or groups try to go and do a half-mile of street or a kilometer of street, and it's a very different challenge to stage and install that work, and to get to that scale without a true sort of knowledge and capacity on how to manage something of that scale. And that's fine if you're the city and you have public works and a staff that can do it. But if you're trying to engage the community and do it, or NGOs and do it, you don't want to go too big at first. You want to start small and then grow. Another thing is the language. We're not engineers, but we've had to become engineers. We've had to fake it till we could make it in terms of understanding the language spoken and the language of design for road engineers. Because when we first started doing this, we came in with pretty pictures and diagrams of colors, and it went nowhere with the people who ultimately had to say yes or no around the design of the street. So then we had to kind of change how we would present and design the projects technically to communicate in the language the engineers could read and expect, to make them feel like we were serious. Completely the same design. You could have gone to 2014 and 2022, we might propose the exact same thing, but the language is different internally. Externally, the addition of the paint has been critical, the color, for acceptance and acknowledgement, awareness that this space has changed. It's for a different thing now. Just having the barrier or striping, it doesn't change the language of the street enough in the short term to have people who are just going about their daily lives understand it. And in a historic district, if you can't use paint, there's lots of other options and materials in the palette in those kinds of historic districts, which we've had to work with as well. So there are options. They're not as fun and quick as paint, but there are options. And then finally is the observation, or coming into these projects, we try to be very open where, okay, we've been brought in by a city, we're doing bike lanes and bus lanes, and that's the project. But when we actually speak to people, observe, listen, we have to be very transparent that with our clients that we might not end up with the project that you're imagining today, because when we go through this process, we're going to learn really what the needs are by listening to people. And we've had a number of projects morph pretty dramatically from where they started to where they ended up based on that input and that feedback. And that's okay, because sometimes those other elements can get layered in later, but there's the core thing of what people are wanting or thinking about as a priority. You've got to test it and show them that, and maybe that's actually what is not needed at all, but you have to try it, and that's how you build trust with community members, is actually listening and doing what there's demand for, and then you figure out, did it work or not, or can we layer in some of these other needs as well on top of that, rather than starting with a thing that you think is a need, but maybe the community doesn't hold to be true.
Well, interesting. Stefano, would you want to add anything on top of that right now?
Well, actually, yeah, I think the fact that don't give up at the first no, because we had loads of no. We're still having a lot of no. So I think it's the fact that you push towards an idea. I think it's the one that you need to keep in mind and don't give up. I mean, it's part of the advocacy that we have, it's part of the fact on one side, it's a profession, it's a job, it's also activism on one side. So it's this kind of in-between area where we are working on.
Cool. I mean, I've heard no assumptions, observe. Start smaller than small, and don't stop at the first no. I believe that everyone here in the room can relate to their own home situation, and you can apply it from Monday on, I believe. Or maybe if you come back to the office tomorrow, then tomorrow on already. I would like to ask one critical question, and Zdeněk, don't take it personally, but how do you, in your projects, build up for courage? Because one way, you are brought in by city, the three of you. On the other hand, without courage, on the side of the city, and people like Zdeněk and others, how can any project move forward? So how do you help even the city officials that are open-minded enough to bring you in? How do you help them build up for courage?
I mean, for us, it's about the narrative and the data, and being able to explain the why up front, and then being able to show on the back end what worked and being very honest about what didn't. And as a political leader or department, changing course or trying something else when it might not work as intended. Because if you can do that and have the narrative of that from the beginning, people know they have the agency to say, yes, we love this, or no, this is not what we want, or we can change this. And if you're then responsive to that, the next time you ask to go and experiment and try something a little bit bold or not known, then you will have more trust to do it because you responded from the last time. So that narrative is important, setting the framework and then being able to measure, evaluate, and being honest about things that aren't working as planned and following through.
Cool, thank you. Petra, how about you?
Actually, most or a large part of our work in Central Europe is for private clients, generally speaking, developers. So even the Florence project, there is a city public-private partnership, but there's a big private interest. So perhaps I'll answer it from that lens, because I think what we've been trying to bring back to this region from, let's say, our experience and our work in the UK for the last 6, 7, 8 years, that we've been sort of carving out more and more projects in this region consciously, because we want to sort of improve and bring back things, and also the timing of it, because I was showing the legacy of the architecture in our context, the legacy of city planning in our context, and of the political regime, etc. This takes a really long time to change. So we have really seen in the last 7, 8 years a mind shift in private sector, and this is caused by a number of factors, but also, you know, the users being more educated and more demanding about what they want. It's no longer just about having an apartment to live in, but they also care about the spaces and the streets around it and the neighborhoods as a whole. So this is becoming more and more important. There's more competition for developers to actually do a good job, and they can see the benefit of doing a good job in terms of the value that that is being created. And I'm talking both about economic value and social value, which is the value that the city hall wants to see. So this idea of the public-private partnership is about the city safeguarding that public interest, but obviously the private interest is also about the financial viability. And I think as practitioners, we need to understand this equation and have a win-win situation. So I think that what we have been doing was very much being a mediator between the city hall, the developer, and the public. And we've been brought in because we're not the architects of the buildings. We are dealing with everything in between, the strategy, long-term strategy of a number of master plans and large areas. It is the common ground. We see this as the shared space upon which we can actually talk about the shared values. Because if you start from talking about values around the private space, which is for the developer, the product, and really this is the language, I mean, which an investor would use, then that conversation with the city hall is very different. But if you start from the shared space, the common space, I think this is where we have been able to shift mindsets slightly, and I hope that, you know, that we had a little part in helping transform on a number of projects or conversations and collaborations. And I think the Florence project is a great example where I forgot to mention, obviously we're working with architects on it, two large Prague-based practices here. So yeah, I think it's a long process, and it's a mind shift, and it's this mediating role in between, which we are trying to where we're trying to make change and shift opinions about what is important.
Yeah, that links perfectly with what Stefano said at the beginning. Don't stop at the first no. At the same time, and if I switch the question, how do you deal with resistance from both from public or political opponents? Zdeněk starts to laugh, of course, because he's not 100% supported, of course, by the other coalition partners. And so maybe 1, 2, 3 guides for Zdeněk as well, how to deal with this kind of resistance, which is mainly ideological. You mentioned it already. It's mainly ideological. So maybe a toolkit, not only for you, for other guests here in the audience. Any tips? Who wants to start? Stefano, please.
Actually, sometimes you got those resistance voices that are very noisy. So the more noisiest voices. So sometimes maybe it's hard to see and point out which are the community you're working for. Children's doesn't have a voice, a strong voice. Carers maybe doesn't have the strongest voice. Maybe some very resistant citizens has a strong voice. So maybe hear just their voice. So it's very important to understand that maybe the quiet community are the larger one. So the one that actually you're affecting and actually can support your work. And sometimes you just need to find a way to give them a voice so that the fact that they show up. Otherwise, the only thing that will show up is people against the project. So you need to find a way to show the voices of the other part of the community. Because for sure, I show you, you're basically you have 20 people, let's say 25. So I'm relating to the fact that maybe you're deleting 20 car parking lot, and on the other side you got hundreds of people. So find a way to show that you got hundreds of people supporting that, and you are affecting the life of those people, and that's just maths. So it's you cannot say anything about maths, fortunately.
I think in Jersey City, it's been a good example where there's been plenty of resistance in a number of neighborhoods. So one, going to where there's demand to start, so you're showing and not telling, and building demand in places where they might be more conservative about change, and people could, in their daily life, see those changes starting to happen other places and then want to opt into it. That's been effective, as is the duration of the projects. Don't go and try and do 1 to 3 year project. Start with the weekend. It's that Soho example where we were able to uncover that there's actually huge support for those kinds of changes, both in the neighborhood and people visiting and from broader neighborhoods around the city. That is very much not what our client was hearing from their board members, or is not hearing in some of the public meetings that we did for that project. And so that demonstration, that one weekend, that 1 week long timeline, that 1 hour timeline, it can be extremely effective at uncovering where that demand and support is, and it's oftentimes very different than what political leaders think. That's not what they're hearing. So the sort of other side of that is bring the political leaders to the project. Make sure they come and stop and see it for themselves and talk to people themselves about what's changed, even if it's for one Saturday. That is, and there's a whole materials toolkit for those very temporary demonstration projects that are really important to get comfortable with before you think about let's transform this for the next couple of years, because that is a different timeline and has a more permanent impact. That can be a way to ensure that you don't build the support, because people are just going to be resistant from the beginning. So you got to know when and how to intervene.
Thank you, Mike. Petra, would you want to add?
Yeah, just I think communication is really important, and the narrative that when we talk about particularly long-term projects which take many years to realize, I think it's really, people can relate to visualizations of the future that will be in 10 years' time, by the time their children will no longer be using that playground or whatever is in that nice picture. So I think it's where the tactical urbanism and the meanwhile use and temporary interventions really come to play, because they actually create those genuine opportunities for people to have experiences, to be in the space together, and that can be used as a moment for the city hall or the developer and everyone to actually have a consultation process which is not about I like it, I don't like it, but it's about actually really understanding of what that community needs and identifying the local players who could be actually in the future even occupying some of the spaces of that development in terms of the active frontage, the retail, educational facilities and so on, because you need to build a network of partners. So it's not just about the physical city making, but it's about who are the drivers of that programming and that activity that happens, because often developments are built and then it's this sort of cutting the red tape and it's the grand opening, but it takes time for people to even put it on their mental map, like I was showing this mental map. So, there's this new place they can go to. If this starts happening during the process, while the planning in the background is going through all that, regulations, etc., and the drawing, while if there's a real activity going on site, then that really helps.
Thank you. We come back to a topic that already popped up, that was communication, storytelling, very important one. But before we come back to that, I want to give you here in the audience a chance to ask a few questions. Then I have a slide of questions, and then I'll come back to a few of mine if we have time. So Yeah, well, ladies first. Petra, it's your turn.
I would like to ask how is possibility of doing tactical urbanism in reality incorporated in your law? Because in our practice it's very difficult. We face very much barriers. For example, when it's prohibited to paint on the streets. The only possibility is to build residential zone, and then you can paint on the street. So how is it in your countries?
If I may only add on that, maybe stepping back, if you don't know the local laws, of course, which would be typical, do you have any example from your past projects? What needed to be done on the legal side within the country before you could even step into tactical urbanism projects? Because there would be a playbook. There are so many countries with outdated laws, and maybe we need to make one or two steps even backwards. So if there is any experience, I didn't know that.
Well, yeah, of course, like I was showing in the presentation, the first things was like sitting on the table with local police, infrastructure department, and understand which were the thing that actually they agreed on. So, for example, in Italy, you cannot pay the car lanes, it's not allowed, but if you consider the car lane stop when you got the white line, so that's the beginning of another part of the street. So the deal was, if we create a system that show the fact that that's the end of the car lane with bollards, with planters, with bike racks, that was enough for local police and infrastructure. So you just need to, every city will have a specific things. They think about residential streets can be your Troyors, I don't know, to get into the thing. And then as long as they see that it's safe, it doesn't need to have like 50 centimeters of curbside to make it safer. So it's, I think it's, you need to start from that. And for us was this, considering the car lane that stop on the white line, and from that, considering and preserve the pedestrian area. So that was the first thing.
It really does get that specific in our projects, in New York, where a lot of this work was germinated from a city level. There's those basic learnings that, well, as long as we have the double white line around the perimeter, in the traffic manuals and the laws, you can't cross over that double white line, so it's no longer, drivable space. So like little hacks like that on the regulations worked well, but even before that, most cities have a permit or a process for people to do events in the streets, whether that's a block party, a gathering, a music festival. So we started just pulling those permits and saying, we're going to do this block party and you have a permit for that. But instead of having the block party where we just barbecued food, we also painted the street and we did other things. And so there's like little things you can take advantage of. And most of the time, cities aren't sending out people to check that, your block party is exactly what they imagine as a block party. You can just be a little more flexible with that. So special event permits are one way to think about it. Another thing is that all cities that we've worked with have manuals or guidance around how construction projects have to happen in streets. And so very early, we weren't using paint yet. We were using the language of construction zones, the signage, the cones, the temporary traffic tape that goes by to maintain travel lanes in a construction site. And we might just change the words on the signs, or we could get slightly different colored cones, like little things like that where you already have regulations around temporary things in your city. Just remix them a little bit, apply them a little bit differently to get started, and then you can start to show that this is not so scary, this work, and you can grow from there. And finally, sometimes we can't even start with that, so we create the program first. Here's the expectations. This is going to be predictable and rational. There's these insurance forms to fill out, like creating all of that in advance so that when you roll out the program, the immediate thing is not, no, we've never done this before. No, there's an expectation on how this is going to go for the citizens in community groups, and this is how we do it here. And then you can always evolve the program over time as it does or does not work well.
Thank you. Was it okay, Petra? There was another question over there by Peter Bednar. Petjo.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I have questions for all three of you, so I'll just ask them right away. Maybe Mike, with you, you showed small thumbnails of projects in Bella Vista and Rogers, Arkansas. I have good experience with both of these cities. I live there, and these are probably some of the most conservative areas, not just in the U.S. but also in the world. So, what was your case for implementing a bike lane in an area that doesn't bike and doesn't really care that much about climate change? Then for Petra, I'm interested in what is your assessment of Rishi Sunak's diatribes against the hallucinated tyranny of a 15-minute city and its kind of ability to stop ongoing projects and maybe actually provide lasting change against these implementations? And for Stefano, I'm always curious with Italian cities. There was this program in the 1960s, the Zone Traffico Limitato, sorry for the Italian, and it always seems like that this program ended sometimes in the 70s, and then whatever you're doing now is something different. So is it still part of it, or is it a different program, or what is the legacy of the ZTL? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'll try to remember all of them. I'll remind you. Mike, would you want to start, please?
How did you end up in Bella Vista, Arkansas?
Well, that would be a different story if I may tell. That's for tonight.
Come see me afterwards. That's
I definitely will.
It's a very rural community. You know, that part of Arkansas actually is the region of where Walmart, the corporation, is headquartered. And they, through the children of the founder, the grandchildren now, have this foundation where they're investing a huge amount of money in quality of life. And I feel like the words we use and what we talk about and how we talk about this kind of project, you don't say anything about climate change there. You talk about quality of life, right? And community and safety. It's more like these values or these words that resonate with that kind of audience. But in any event, we were hired by the foundation to do 3 pilot projects in that region because they had just spent millions and millions of dollars on a 60-kilometer trail, a biking and walking trail that was extremely popular. But the challenge was people had to kind of drive to get to it in most cases, but they weren't very far from these downtowns and these destinations. And so the projects were all about connecting the downtown neighborhoods and the main streets and the square to the trail. And so we did these interim projects to make those connections. And then it was the one where we were also testing all the different barrier elements because they wanted to, take a look at that to see what would perform well there. So in conservative places, you can do it. You just have to think about how you frame the projects.
If I made up on Mike, there was still a strong sponsor of it. There was the Walmart and their foundation. B, it didn't end up with recreational active mobility, with the trails, because nowadays what is happening in Bentonville, they're building up a completely new campus that is completely focused around carless neighborhoods. I had Courtney, who is the mobility manager of Walmart, on my panel in Amsterdam in June on Micromobility Europe. And what they have in their pockets is amazing. She spent 1 month traveling across Europe, Netherlands especially, Denmark partly, to bring all the experience without the need to reinvent the wheel back to Bentonville, to bring the best lessons. And I believe this, what I'm stepping in is, there is so much to be learned from all around the world already now. There is no need for none of you to reinvent the wheel. So much has been done in the cities. Smaller, medium, large cities, conservative, progressive. Just pick up the best toolbox. That would be my just follow up on that. So yeah, thank you, Mike. There was another question for Petra, and of course, just to give a context, what Petra asked, there was a really aggressive communicational step into a low traffic neighborhood movement that was running through UK since COVID, but the current conservative government of UK, including Prime Minister, really started to disperse hoaxes even against the 15-minute city concept by Carlos Moreno, who was the guest of Petra and her team here in Prague 1.5 years ago, if I remember correctly. Yeah, Petra, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I was really trying not to give any airtime to Rishi Sunak in my talk, and I actually had had the cover of the article next to the 15-minute city diagram, and I decided not to include it, just to not give it airtime. But it is a really, really concerning course of events. It really upsets many people who are trying to go ahead with changes towards greener and welcoming cities. I mean, it comes back to the point of political leadership. If the vision for a sustainable city is not shared at the top level, then it's really hard to go forward speedily. So general elections are in the UK next year. So some of these statements, I believe, are, about populist kind of statements to get voters, and the language used, such as protecting motorists, is kind of really worrying. I think, we can just all go and vote. Everyone has their vote in the elections, and that's all we can do in terms of the political leadership.
Okay,
It reflects
thank you.
the society, yeah.
Before we come to Stefano and answer the question, Zdeněk will need to leave us pretty soon. If I know, it's okay. Okay, then I misunderstood. Then Stefano, is your turn, and then I have a few questions for you.
Well, yeah, you specifically talk about the traffic limited zone. It's still happening, but you need an infrastructure to deal with. So you need cameras. Cameras needs infrastructure, construction. You need, budget-wise, maybe one tactical square addressing the same cost of a CCTV system to control who is getting into the square. So it's still happening, but they got different time frame. But that's part of the same vision on addressing the city. It's always happening a lot in the historical center, because that's way more easier and make much more sense, because the streets are narrow and people are more used to walk there because there's no parking lot. So it's part of it's still happening, it's part of that, but just work on different time frame.
Thank you. Well, there was a question from. Get your questions ready. I'll switch to Slido for the moment, but then I'll come back to you. But Slido, for Prague specifically, and for Zdeněk, then theoretically on the paper, Prague is pro-sustainable transportation in all the declarations and everything. But practically, Prague doesn't stick to its declarations and strategies. So A, why? And B, is there anything that helped you already today to think about how to get your coalition colleagues maybe more on board to fulfill the declarations, even asking maybe one or two advices from the three honorable speakers that we already had here?
Yes. Well, regarding the time schedule, I thought I will have to leave, but I have found out that I rescheduled my program so I could stay here with you on this conference.
That's cool. Thank you.
But regarding the sustainability of transport in Prague, we have the sustainable mobility plan that will need to be updated. It's a periodical update, regular update that will happen, I think, next year. Not absolutely sure, but in, let's say, quite short time. So that is one thing that we will have to do. Second thing is we are, I think, doing most of the things that we decided to do in the previous mobility plan. Of course, we put strong emphasis on the public transport. This is very important here in Prague. But we also do a lot of things regarding the pedestrian moving on foot, basically, through the city. And if I could, for example, talk about one thing, for example, the pedestrian crossing in front of the main train station. We have a nice historical building of the train station here, and there is a huge street going in front of that building, so it's basically a highway through the middle of through the middle of the city, and quite recently we added a pedestrian crossing on one place where there was already the traffic lights, so there was not that much controversy about that, although there were people who were criticizing that. I do not understand why, but it happened. And right now we agreed on the level of the city council with a pedestrian crossing directly in front of that historical building of the main railway station, and there are no lights now, so we will have to add the lights and so on. And at this moment I have found one thing, that even if you have the courage, even if you negotiate somehow the political support and you are agreed on that with the city districts and so on, you still have to face another challenge, and this is in this case the cultural heritage people, and the second thing is the police, because to my surprise, even if local politicians all agree on certain thing, the local police could still have objections regarding the sufficient flow of traffic, or I'm not sure.
That's the right core.
Yeah.
But
so it's not just about safety, which they care about, which is, I think, of course, quite natural, but they also think about the natural flow of traffic, which was quite surprised, because this means that the local politicians and local people do not have actually the right to decide if they want to restrict cars from somewhere, because you need to have a stamp from the police and they could have a different opinion, which is quite surprising. So we wanted originally to restrict the car lanes to 2+2, which is unfortunately not going to happen, although we have an unanimous vote on that in the city council. It will be 2+3. And this is, and the pedestrian crossing will not have one green light for the pedestrians for all 2+3 lanes, because it's simply not possible due to the need for the traffic flow, which I was quite surprised that this is so extremely bureaucratic process here. And yes, and the other funny thing will be the trees, which they want to plant in front of the historical main railway station building, because here the cultural heritage people come into play, and the trees were never there, so of course they will be against that. So this is the funny thing that we are facing here, that maybe are specific for our beautiful city.
Mike, would you like to give some toolbox to help with Zdeněk? Any experiences?
I mean, no, it's just funny because it's elements of those issues play out everywhere. But you know, the heritage one I understand is a huge challenge here at a scale that maybe we don't deal with in the U.S. It's particularly the longevity of that heritage is a very different thing, which I acknowledge. But it just makes me laugh that before there was a Prague, there was probably trees and fields here, right? So it's very selective heritage, you know, and we see that everywhere. But yeah, I think there's a battle that has to be played out in this situation where who can go above or direct the police to...
It's not binding. Their comment is not binding. That's a critical point.
Is it the mayor?
It's not binding.
It is binding. Well, actually...
It is not. It is not.
Well, it should not be, but effectively it is, because the point is that then there is a decision of a governmental clerk which does not take orders from the municipality. So it's
legally in the process, just to be clear for our foreign guests.
You have external and you have internal barriers, obviously. And so you have this mobility plan update coming in the next 12 to 18 months. That seems like an amazing opportunity to incorporate demonstrations as part of the engagement, outreach, conversation, awareness building part of that plan making. And in that, maybe you're able to get permissions from the police to try some of these ideas that they might normally be against, but because it's for one day, maybe there's going to be some flexibility. Just a thought that start to see these ideas when you have this moment of awareness and investment in the planning process.
That's cool, yeah. Any other support for Zdeněk and what is ahead of him and his team? Stefan? Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead. Stefan. Yeah, please.
Yeah, this is it's a really it's a constant situation in so many places, and I just think it's really important to point out the fact that no one really knows what you're talking about until, like, the police won't rally around you. You need the police to rally around you. You need all of these different departments who are currently a block to rally around you, and they don't know how to do that. They don't know why they should do that until they have some good reason, and especially from some kind of public demand. Now, that public demand is hard to build if nobody's ever seen one of these examples, and this is where your question comes in of, okay, how do we show this if we're not allowed to paint the ground? The construction material or the construction barriers this is where the creativity comes in. This is where the problem solving comes in from the ground of, you have to show people what you're talking about in order for them to then communicate that demand. And I think all of these things happen at different timescales, and of course with different, different champions need to come in at some point, but ultimately you just have to feel this difference in space, whatever that takes, in order to then start to break down some of these barriers, because there's so many reasons why we can't do anything ever. There's a long list in every city. It just have to break through at some point. And maybe it's this kid running through the the street at some point and getting people to see that he can do that now instead of what he didn't used to be able to do, something.
Yes, if I can shortly comment, in this specific case, we had to simply downgrade from 2+2 lanes to 2+3. That was the first thing, and then agree with the devised pedestrian crossing. That means the people will need to stop in between those 2+3 lanes and wait a while. And yes, we hope that this will be something like the first step, and then maybe we will be able to open the discussion again, and because there will be another opportunity, because there will be something happening across that street where currently there's basically nothing, so it's quite hard to explain why the pedestrian crossing is the necessary right now, because there will be something in the future, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to make sure, clear for everyone who understands, Simon Battisti, who stepped into the panel, will have a presentation specifically on changing another city. Not only one, but currently it's Tirana in Albania with his experience. And there's a presentation coming tomorrow. So you already had a first glimpse of what is coming and the energy, and I'm really looking forward to his presentation tomorrow. I hope you will enjoy it as well. Let's jump back to questions. Any questions here in the audience, please? I want to give you as much room as I can. I can see over there, Domenico, if I may ask. Thank you.
Hi. My question is probably aimed at Stefano, but maybe also for the others, if they have something. You said in the basic knowledge you gained, there is a need for the city to have a dedicated team of people within the system. And I would like to ask, what are their tasks? What does it mean? What they do? Do they start with the project and lead it till the realization, or what's their task? Because if I compare it to Prague, the problem I think is very fractured, or distributed responsibility. The city outsources projects for external engineers, for external project managers. They don't have in-house experience. So I'd like to ask about how the process in Milano happens, from the scratch to the realization. How big part is in-house project, maybe?
Yeah. Well, it actually all started because of a political vision on the project, and starting from the fact that the first square was actually designed not by the team but two interns of the of the deputy mayor's staff. But that's starting from, let's say, from that point, the need of a specific team. Well, in Italy, it's very clear how to done. Let's say each major city can have an agency in-house owned by the municipality to do these more technical things. So it's more common to hire consultancy about specific topic that maybe the city staff cannot deal with. But it doesn't happen. Well, it's not really an outsource of the design. It's just to help the city staff, the engineer of the city of Milan, let's say, to work on changing the pattern or shift the perspective on the things. So if you need to, someone would say, you need to find champions around the city, the working people, in order to start with the first project. So if you see that, actually it has started that with the head of the mobility, planning of mobility department saying, okay, yeah, maybe I'm interested in that, let's show me something. So you need someone to fulfill that request, and usually it's not possible to be done by, let's say, engineer that are already working for the municipality. So it has all been structured like that. So it's basically, it's my job, so right now, and it has started from 2 interns to more than 15 people working on the topic. It's not just open square, it's not just Piazza Aperte. It's trying to bring the public space design into all the different city levels, from reviewing the private construction proposals with a public space attitude, from trying to add or to review infrastructure transformation, usually done with a transportation focus, with let's say, an active mobility attitude. So it's very supporting. So it's not outsourcing, but just supporting and help them get into a point that now it's pretty much shared. So after 5 years, now public space is in the agenda of the city. It took a while, but everybody now agrees that it's the backbone of the city to have a quality public space. I don't know if I answered, but it's quite specific for each city, but this is how Milan has solved it.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it's really important to have build the capacity in municipalities, and it seems to be that in different cities, at some point after some bottom-up initiatives or a first pilot project, there needs to be a dedicated team, and whether it's called Piazza Aperte or in London there is the Good Growth program, which is not just about tactical urbanism, but it's covering good growth, which is all about different aspects of sustainability and how that is realized through different community projects, public space projects, and so on. And I mean, you have the Institute of Planning here, IPRE, in Prague, which has a public spaces department. So from my point of view, I don't know the ins and outs of how IPRE works, but there needs to be a strong leadership on the topic from IPRE who are a dedicated organization serving, so related to the city hall. And the Pražské židle and stolky program, the chairs and tables in Prague, which the bistro chairs that you see around, I believe was part of the public spaces team at IPR, and then it was taken out to Kreativní Praha, a different organization, which is more of a culture organization. And I don't know the inside story of this decision, but it seems to be that it's sort of been shifted towards sort of something to do with art and culture rather than something to do with livability of the city. From my point of view, perhaps this should be more tightly controlled and directed with a strong vision from IPRE and the city hall. But I'm not drawing any conclusions because I don't know enough of the inside. Maybe you can
Yeah, I can comment that probably it was considered a good idea at that time when we made that decision, but unfortunately I'm not able to remember why, what was the rationale behind it. But I think it's not the biggest problem regarding the curators of the Prague tables and chairs. Maybe
we will have a presentation later today, so
maybe
we'll come back to that.
A bit more. The bigger problem is that the chairs and tables are so famous and favorite that they simply got lost from the public spaces because people tend to probably take them with them. So specifically in front of our city hall, we have a problem like that, but probably we should count on that because you know what is said about the city hall in Prague. It's always a stealing there, so maybe it's a connection with that, but never mind.
The job for the police.
Exactly.
Yeah. Be more productive.
But again, specifically Mariánské náměstí and tables and chairs will have a presentation later today. So I'll suggest that we'll move forward. There was a question, someone in the back. Mike is coming. Thank you.
I have a question for Stefano. Thank you for your presentation, first of all. My question is, we saw restaurants, bar, and cafe located next to the place that you transform. So are shopkeepers involved in the process at the beginning, and how do they respond? Like, do they support this transformation, or do they block the tactical urbanism? And the second question, sorry, is it's a bit provocative. Do you think in the long term, the implementation, the full-scale implementation of tactical urbanism would actually discourage municipality in investing money for permanent redesign of square, because like tactical urbanism is cheaper and flexible? Or do you think it is a driver and would propel actually permanent redesign of squares? Thank you.
So let's start from the first one. Well, actually, let's say 80% of the situations, commercial activities are not very happy about the transformation, and it's a very common worldwide. They think that customers need to drive into their shop because they will sell more. Yeah, that's the basic their idea. But we got two, I think, well, lots of different situations, but two are very important to be shared. One of the pilot, so the one in front of the school, when we were talking about optimization process with the engineers. Here we had a bar, a cafe that actually had run a campaign against the project. Campaigning means to stay all day with the microphone talking about against the project in front of the construction site. So very against. And all because he saw that a two-way back transform into a one-way was the worst things for their commercial activity. And now, after 5 years, that square is the place to be of the new neighborhood. So it's like, we don't have the number of people. Now you got a lane of people waiting for asking to be served by the bar. So it's completely. But then on another occasion where actually we had two commercial activities involved, they were pushing for the transformation. The one that I was actually showing about definition of car lanes, and they did the maths, and they said that their income are at actually 30% more after the implementation. So every time one commercial activity will try to push back, we say, I give you a telephone number, you talk to them, and then you talk back to us. So that's the thing. But with second thing, it's more general. Second question, I think it's, I will also pass the mic to the rest of the speakers. But personally, I think it's the fact that we look at the city as a more adaptive organism, I think is the thing to go with. So I'm fine with the fact that temporary things can happen and can be the tools to shape the city of the future. I think we are incorporated these things, and I'm not afraid that the people want to transform the city with like capital construction. Green areas need to be done in that way. So it's some goals you cannot reach with the tactical urbanism tools. So all the sustainability, deep paving approaches need to maybe pass through the tactical urbanism phase, like I show you, like in that process. But still, you cannot address all the challenges we have through that toolkit. I think that's pretty shared with the whole knowledge and people that are in charge of this.
I love that question. It's one of my favorites, so thank you for asking it. I think it's really important when cities think about starting a new program that they don't think about the how to get the thing installed first. They're also thinking about how long and what's going to be required if it doesn't get rebuilt in 3 years, but 5 or 10 or 20, and we make sure we have the resource and the process in place to maintain, continue to adapt, and use the space productively before it gets rebuilt. I'll also say that some spaces can be really lovely forever as really flexible, lightweight, inexpensive spaces, but if they are sensitive areas with traffic safety or the need for green infrastructure, if there's flooding, et cetera, that's a very clear indicator that there has to be more than just paint, pots, and chairs. So it does bring up the question of like, will we never invest in this at all? That's obviously a problem, but I think it's kind of a both and response that a city can take, and to really be thinking through, one of the first plazas in New York in 2007, in the neighborhood where we work, is just now being rebuilt. It was supposed to start in 2012. 5 years after it was implemented, it's just starting now 12 years after that. So, these things can take a long time, but just think about all the accrued value of the interim and the temporary in the 16 years it's taken to get into construction. That might not have been there without this process in the first place. So there's a huge amount of value in that temporary, more permanent temporary project that's now going permanent.
A nice value in the spectrum. Something could be really for one day a week or a month, and that might take 16 years before it really gets permanent. Petra, yeah.
Coming back to your question, from our research for the Meanwhile City book, it's so many people involved in those projects have said the temporary project had stayed far longer than they had ever anticipated. And again, I'm not just talking about transformation of streets, but also temporary use of buildings. And I think this is where it becomes important because it adds value. So either you have an empty building for the next 10 years where you're thinking about what happens with it, or you have a meanwhile use for 10 years. But if you come into the planning process, and in the UK, meanwhile use is already a use class, so this is an important sort of legal point. So local authorities evaluate meanwhile use differently to permanent use, and then also it's in theory should be easier to get planning permission, etc. It's not always the case on the ground, but it's a case-by-case basis. But it is, so for instance, you've got a 7-story car parking garage in South London, Peckham Levels, which had been transformed into co-working spaces and artist studios and community spaces. And I think that it all actually builds momentum for some kind of permanent change or transformation in the future. And this was talked about by all three of us. I think that the point is that even if the project after a while is dismantled, then there is always a change. Either there's a permanent project or there's a different change. I mean, it always sort of, the action has a reaction. So I think it's about testing, and I wouldn't worry about the permanent projects not happening, because I think actually all of the temporary ones help. And we could even theorize about, isn't the city temporary in its every moment that you look at it? Isn't it always in evolution? But that is a philosophical debate, perhaps.
Yeah, well, you touched, all three of you now, even including the question, touched upon an important topic. That was how to bring the story over, whether it's for 1 day a week or 1 day a month, how to communicate any changes, temporary or long-term, and to keep it maximum practically for all the audience here. It's not a specific Czech issue, but still one of the most asked questions in Slido as well. That was linked, any change linked to a loss, and I hate this framing, but to change of car parking spaces into a different purpose. So let's try to link the two topics: communication, how to communicate well, better than Zdeněk's team does so far, for instance, and what kind of toolbox can be used specifically on a topic of repurposing car parking spaces to something different, something that is more for people. Mike, would you like to start?
I would never lead with we're losing 10 parking spaces.
Exactly.
Like, don't talk about that, right? That might be part of what's happening, but there's a bigger vision and bigger thing that's happening. We're getting 40 new seats and 18 new trees, and talk about all the plus side first is probably the basic communication advice that I think most cities understand at this point, that you got to keep on the positive side. But there will be the fights, there will be the people who will be smart enough to dig into the plans, and they'll look at them and say, wait, now there's 10 spaces that are missing. And if that happens, you have to be able to think about how you take that information as it may become public through campaigns and address it. So be prepared to address it if you have to. I just wouldn't lead with it. And generally, there's reasons behind these projects that are bigger than just the projects themselves. And so you have to be talking about that framing all along the way, and why, the why. And then it's going to be a little different in each city on what the hot topic or the need is. Like in New York right now, everything's about flooding because of that massive rainstorm. So everyone's talking about spongy streets and green infrastructure, and right. So can we attach the next project with that framing of, well, we're going to have 30 square meters of pavement no longer there because we're doing X, Y, or Z, right? Like tying it into the conversation of the day so it remains relevant and clear to people why you're doing the project.
That's good. Petra, before I come back to you, UK, one of the most successful reframing campaigns was not, the street is not closed, but it's actually open. It's closed only for cars, but becomes open to people on walking, cycling, on wheelchairs, to play and stuff like this. And this kind of reframing, do you have any other advice or experience how to use communication to an advance of a tactical urbanism measure?
We talked a lot about this with Simon, and I'm sure he'll mention in his talk tomorrow. It's main part of his job, but it's a narrative around children, and I think the younger generations also in this geographic area where we are. I think has been so much change, and it's been very dramatic for the older generations to adapt to all these new things happening, and why should they even be part of them? So I think the younger generation kids are very good sort of focus group. A good example from my experience is that, generally speaking, I cycle with my son to school, and some parents do, but not huge amounts, of course. This is in Bratislava now, where I'm based now. And in September, the school always or take part in the Clean Air Day, the World Clean Air Day. And they always send an email to parents saying, like, tomorrow is the Clean Air Day, have a think, maybe you can take the tram, take a bike, etc. And one day in September, we got to school, and suddenly I had no place for my son's bike because there were so many bikes. And I was telling to the head mistress, saying, like, this is amazing, everybody's really coming on board with this. I'm so happy, they finally got it. And she was like, it's a Clean Air Day. And I was like, oh, I didn't know, but you didn't send an email, actually. And she was saying, but we told the children, and the children, obviously, I can't get any information from my 7-year-old son what he did at school. There's zero, he doesn't feel the need to tell me what he was doing there because it's in the past, and he was like, why should I tell you, like, what I had for lunch or what I was learning or anything. So obviously, these primary school children who generally don't relay a lot of information to parents what's happening at school, they thought it important and wanted and felt really that they want to be part of this, and it's important for them. So they went home and told the parents, tomorrow is Clean Air Day, we really should, and I really want to try a different way of going to school. And so the parents did that for their children, not because they knew.
They got an email.
Not because of an email, because the email was missed out this time. So I think that's a good sort of story that illustrates And then I think, a lot of what the mayor in Tirana is doing, and Simon will speak about it tomorrow, is about that, how can the children influence the parents' decisions, and the parents generally are listening to their children more than perhaps they're listening to the headmistress of the school or the politician or somebody telling them, this is what you should be doing. So I think the key to communicating is also around the topic of safety of kids and health, air quality.
Thank you. Stefano, how did you communicate the transformation of parking spaces in Milan, for instance?
Well, I must be very honest. At the beginning, we were very bad in communicating. So we had huge backlash. Well, it means that maybe residents of the neighborhood didn't know that what's going on. There was a construction site, and maybe someone that didn't know what's going on. And that can create a critical mass against the project. Maybe they would have been supportive just if they were involved. So so you got the two different levels. You got, I was explaining, we were doing the pilots project to create a procedure. So we were very focused on that. Sometimes you forget that it's not just about that. If you don't talk to all the people in the neighborhood, you create a small public meeting to explain. Also, people that can be supportive can give you a pushback on the project because it's their place and they were at least communicated by the local authorities. So we're getting now. Well, actually, COVID has completely changed the way of public meeting. So most of them now, we do sometimes live events, but most of the meeting with all the stakeholders are still happening remotely. And that's allowed a lot of people to participate because it's really, they can have a break, 20 minutes by work, they can be somewhere else. So this is kind of expanding the audience somehow. So these things is still working with remotely or online meeting and live meeting. I think it's a good mix. And then the fact that after the first 4 years, we have stopped and looked at what we've done to also communicate numbers, data that can build a narrative. I think it was very, very important. Still, we still need to improve that kind of things because it's weird. Giving back to the idea of the design team, you get few people, so you need to decide whether you do another project, you advocacy for the project you've done, you monitoring is very hard. So it needs loads of energy, loads of people to monitor, but it's very important in a specific step, because otherwise you have nothing to communicate. But you need, at a certain point, you need to say, should I do another project, or should I monitor better the other one? So you're the same person, so you need, it's more complex, but what you should do, push forward the change, or bring and build the demand or the critical mass around it. It's challenging because you need to done everything of these things, but you need to balance.
No, I wanted to say I'm really sorry. I will have to leave now due to the things that are happening now. So thank you very much, and I hope I will meet you in the evening. So thank you.
Well, thanks for being with us. It's a clear message from your position, not you as a person, but your position as well, that this conference has gained the value. So again, applause to Petra and the team because you're doing an amazing job. Thank you. Thank you. See you later today. We are running.